I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome you, everyone who's tuning in to this conversation, authors at BCFG. I'm Angela Duckworth. I'm a professor at Wharton and at the University of Pennsylvania. I am most relevant for this conversation. I am thrilled to be a co-director along with Katie of the Behavior Change for Good initiative. And when we say authors at BCFG, what we really mean is authors at the Behavior Change for Good initiative. So Katie, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Of course, I know that you are a professor as well at Wharton, and you'll be saying things more relevant to our speakers today than to ourselves and other aspects of our project.
Yes, I am really excited to get to introduce our amazing author panelists. And let me actually also mention that we are going to have Q&A later in the session. We'll start with Q&A that Angela and I get to drive on, but you guys will get to ask your questions. So you can start putting questions at any time into the little Q&A box if you're eager to get them in there. So let me just introduce our amazing panelists. So we're thrilled to have Professor Dolly Chugh of New York University, who is the author of the book, The Person You Mean to Be. Oops, hold on, I gotta get it here. The Person You Mean to Be. And also the newsletter, Dear Good People, which is a fantastic read. And all of these things are gonna be put in the chat so you can find them. I'm putting this back on my bookshelf now. Let me next introduce
the next one. I'll be the Vanna White for the next one.
Okay, you do the Vanna White, then they won't like me stretching. Our next guest is Professor Bob Cialdini of Arizona State University, and he is the author of the book Influence. I want to do it too. I feel left out if I don't also do it. Like, I want to do it too. And then also we have Professor Wendy Wood of the University of Southern California talking about her book, Good Habits, Bad Habits. Yay! And we love all of these books and all of these people and all of these scientists and collaborators of ours. So just so excited to have you. I get to start. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually ask each of you just to share a sentence or two describing the gist of what your book is about, and then we'll get into some meatier material. So let me actually ask Dolly to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. It's a great crowd. I'm noticing in the participants so many familiar faces and new faces. The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias is what I call the smart, semi-bold person's guide to battling bias and championing diversity and inclusion. And what I mean by that is it's evidence-based, but curated with stories that bring the evidence to life. The research comes from a little bit of my own work, but lots of other people's work, including people who are in the Zoom now. And it offers tools and strategies that you can put to work. I wrote it honestly for myself because I was studying these issues intellectually, but grappling with them in my real life and needed something practical.
And it is an amazing book, and I assign it to my students at Wharton, and you will love it if you haven't picked it up. So please read Dolly's book, and you're gonna get to hear more. I want to turn to Bob, whose book is also assigned, and actually all these books are in part of my class at Wharton. I'm so excited to have this amazing group of authors. Bob, would you tell us a little bit about Influence?
Well, Influence is designed to identify and explicate a set of universal principles of persuasion or influence that, if used ethically, can significantly increase the outcomes of the communicator, but also it's designed to allow us to recognize and resist those same principles when they're used on us in an unethical or undue way. And this is a new edition. I knew that it needed to be written because I have a colleague in Poland, Professor Wilhelmina Wosinska, who said, you know, Bob, your book Influence is so famous in Poland, my students think you're dead. And I thought, well, that's a sobering kind of affirmation of the book. I think it's time to write a new one. So we added 120 pages.
It's wonderful, and truly, I have never thought you were dead, but I certainly think that you have achieved so much. There should be statues. Okay, let's turn to the amazing Wendy Wood, whose incredible book, Good Habits, Bad Habits, is also a must read. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So the reason I wrote this book is because research on habit is just exploding in the literature, and people are interested in it, but I wasn't seeing a whole lot of the science getting discussed in the popular literature. And habits aren't something that you can understand by intuiting, because they're part of our non-conscious self. So the research is really important to understanding what they are. And I wasn't seeing that. So I decided I was going to write a book that explained how habits work, how we can form new habits, change ones we don't want in ways that are easy, accessible, make sense to people. So once you have the understanding of what habits are, then it all becomes much more straightforward how to do these things.
That was amazing. I'm going to pass the baton to Angela, and so excited to hear more.
Well, one of my favorite dimensions of all three of these instant classics is the stories. And I sometimes wonder if even scientists learn more from stories than we do from statistics. At least we remember stories perhaps a little better than anything else that we encounter. So I'd like to hear favorite stories from each of these three books, direct from the authors. And Bob, if you wouldn't mind, let's start with you. What's a favorite story from this new version of Influence?
Well, I'm going to give you one that's in a category of what I call the small big. I found in my presentations of these principles that if I ever say to an audience, now, I'm going to give you the smallest thing you can do that will produce the biggest impact on your persuasive success using this particular principle, the room falls silent. And I get the audience attention almost as completely as if I had mentioned sex. Right? Why? Because of return on investment. If you can get something really small that you can do, people are looking for that. So here's one of those. And I put as many of those as I could get into the new book. I have a friend who is what's called a marital mediation professional. In other words, a divorce attorney. But she works as a mediator for those couples that don't want to go to court, and they want to avoid all of that cost and aggravation, and have a mediator help them design a final agreement. Well, she brings them into her office and she puts them in separate rooms. They can't be in the same room. That degenerates into bedlam. So they're in, and she shuttles between the rooms, giving the latest offer and offering some counsel about how to respond to these offers. And she said to me, I wonder if you can help me with the one thing. Frequently, we get to the last issue and it's so stubborn, we can't get over it, and it torpedoes the whole process and they go off steaming to court, right? And it can be something fairly important like custody and visitation of the kids or of the Saint Bernard, right? That, believe me, that happens. Or something relatively minor, anyway. She says, can you help me get through that last one? So I said, tell me, Sandy, what do you say when you bring that last offer to the other side? And she said, what we say is, if you will simply agree to this last offer, we will have a deal. And I said, try this. Go in and say, we have a deal. All you need to do is agree to this. That's using the power of loss aversion. Because if you say we have a deal, now you've got it. And if you refuse, you've lost this valuable thing instead of gaining. We know from Danny Kahneman's work how powerful loss aversion is. So we left the meeting, and a couple of months later, I saw her at a party and she said, Bob, this has been amazing. It works every time. I said, come on, Sandy. It can't work 100% of the time. This is behavioral science. It's not magic. She put her hand on my arm. She said, every time. Well, I still don't believe that it's every time, but I do believe in the power of loss aversion. And if you give somebody the concept that they have something and then need to take a step to retain it, it's a more likely positive outcome.
Thank you. An amazing contemporary parable of loss aversion, which I'll immediately share with Danny when I have our meeting tomorrow. Wendy, would you mind going next? We'd love to hear a favorite story from your book, Good Habits, Bad Habits.
Well, my favorite story is really a piece of research that I think is very clever. It was done a long time ago in the 1980s. And the reason I like this piece of research so much is because I think it illustrates how most of us go about trying to change our behavior. And the behavior in this case was trying to get people to use the stairs instead of the elevator in a 4-story office building. So this is possible, right? What the researchers did is they started trying to convince people, right? Bolstering reasons why you should take the stairs instead of the elevator. So they put up signs, take the stairs. It's good for the environment, saves energy. No effect. So they thought, okay, well, maybe we have the wrong reasons. Let's try something a little different. They put up signs saying, take the stairs, burn calories. It's good for your health. Again, no effect. So what they did, very smart researchers, what they did is they decided, well, maybe we should make it just a little bit more difficult to take the elevator. So they delayed the closing of the elevator door by 16 seconds. And logically, right, that shouldn't make much difference. People can still take the elevator, but it cut elevator use by 1/3. And the really surprising thing about this is when they put the elevator back to its normal speed after a month, people kept taking the stairs. And what this illustrates is that first, people had formed a habit to take the stairs, and they kept doing so even when the elevator was back to normal. But second, so many of our habits depend on the environments that we're in, the context in which we live. And they really depend on what is easy and accessible for us at the moment. And understanding that it's not always our willpower and our decision-making and our reasoning and our conscious desires that drive our behavior. Instead, it can be subtle cues in the environment that make the behavior easier or more difficult, something we call friction. That is really important to forming habits. And that's why I like this story. It shouldn't have worked, but it did.
Wendy, I love that you chose that story in particular for 2 reasons. One is that when I read Good Habits, Bad Habits, I thought to myself, like, this is going to be one of those surprising, potentially like life-changing insights that so many times people rely on willpower. And then you point out in that story and others how it's really about shaping your environment and not using willpower to do that. The second reason I love that is that everybody who's listening right now is a geek. Like, we're all nerds and we all love science. I think what you just showed is that it's not just stories and science, it's that the science is a story if you think about it the right way. So thank you for that one. Okay, Dolly, take us home. Tell us a favorite story. There were so many in your books. I'm just like on tenterhooks, wondering which one you're going to pick.
I know I was a little bit, I got to be a kind of live out my fantasy of being a journalist and interview a lot of people to come up with these stories. My favorite one, I'll tell you the story and then I'll tell you the point that it illustrates, and sort of the key punchline of the book comes through in this story. So for those on the Zoom who took U.S. history classes, if you were in high school in the United States, you probably learned about the lunch counter sit-ins, or perhaps you were part of the lunch counter sit-ins in the 1960s, the part of the civil rights movement. And there's some iconic pictures of 4 young Black men sitting at a lunch counter wearing coats and ties. They were 4 students, college freshmen, who were enrolled at North Carolina A&T and made a plan in their dorm that they were going to peacefully object to the segregated public spaces, including the Woolworths lunch counter. Woolworths, for those who don't know, was a sort of like Panera is now. It was like a fast casual lunch counter, and they sat, and their pledge to each other was they would not get up until they were served. They knew they wouldn't be. They were arrested, they were dragged out, they were killed, or the store closed. That was the pledge they made. And that day, the manager closed the store early, not knowing what to do with these 4 young men. They went back to their dorm, brought back more people the next day and the next day and the next day. And amazingly, even though we didn't have social media, the word spread, and tens of thousands of people were soon sitting in lunch counters across the country. Woolworths was a national chain. And the Greensboro 4, as these 4 young men came to be known, led by Joe McNeil, they were not the first to sit in, they were not the only to sit in, but somehow they were part of a catalyst of a movement when this happened in 1960. Fast forward, Joe McNeil is alive and well, and I'm flipping through channels on TV, and there's a documentary about the Greensboro 4, and they happen to mention where he lives, and I'm like, he lives 3 miles from me. So I reach out to him and introduce myself and cold call him and ask if he would please come speak to my students. And amazingly, he agrees. And this starts this tradition of where he comes and speaks to my students, where he gives remarks, very humble, low key, like if you're picturing some firebrand activists, no, like lots of dad jokes. And then we go to Q&A. And for those who are professors on, you know what it's like when you bring guest speaker, you're like, please, students, please, good questions, be prepared, be respectful. And I was worried, will they get it, who he is? He's an icon, there's statues of him, there's museums of him, the Smithsonian. They totally got it. Wonderful questions, very respectful. We have time for one more question. This is the first time he came to my class, and the student gets up to the mic and says, "Sir, thank you for your service. Thank you for your courage. Sir, what are your views on gay rights?" And it wasn't a great moment. And he publicly stumbled. And I wish I could say I did something courageous, but instead I was like, and we're out of time. And I cut it. And I didn't say anything to him because I had just met him. I had just cold called him. I didn't have the courage. And I invited him back next year. We had the same format, and we're going through the same thing, and I'm sort of in the middle of it being like, oh God, I'm just remembering now what happened last year, but I don't say anything. And we're about to go to Q&A, and he says, "I really want to hear your questions. Ask me the hard ones, because since I was here last year, I have stopped flipping channels when a news story comes on about gay rights. And I have been asking my grandchildren to explain words to me that I don't understand." And we went into the Q&A, and I was privately fascinated, but again, too scared to inquire, until a few more years go by. I become friends with Joe and his wife, Ina. And he agrees to be interviewed for my book. And I interview him, and I'm asking about all the iconic moments he's been part of in history. And then I say, I gotta ask, I finally say, Joe, do you remember what happened at the end of the Q&A the first time you ever came to speak to my students? And I thought I might have to prompt him because he does a lot of speaking. He's, oh, I remember. So what happened between year 1 and year 2? He shook his head and he said, this work of being a good person is hard work. I got stuff to learn. I'm learning. And this blew me away, that this man for whom we owe so much, to whom we owe so much, who is truly one of the heroes of the 20th century, is still viewing himself as a learner in this space. And if he still is, then goodness knows I still am. And to me, that illustrated a key concept in my book, which I call being goodish. Instead of trying to be a good person, think fixed mindset, Carol Dweck, either or, binary, brittle. Being a goodish person, think growth mindset, always room to improve, feedback, coaching, mistakes are all useful. Being goodish, being a higher standard than being good. And what I saw in Joe McNeil was not just someone who showed tremendous courage when he was a teenager, but someone who spent an entire life being goodish. And that for me really hammered the concept of the whole book, which is that this is about building skills, building courage, and building knowledge on a lifelong basis.
Okay, I cried. Thank you, Dolly. That was beautiful. Thank you all for the amazing stories and for the books that are full of more. This is perfect. We have one more question we want to ask each of you, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. So I'm going to ask the audience to start putting them in the Q&A. I already see a bunch popping up, but we're going to turn to you in just a sec. So it's your last chance in the next few minutes to put those questions in. The last question I'm going to ask each of you, and I'll ask Wendy to start, is actually just to give us a prescription, because each of your books is incredibly practical and offers tips on how to live more effectively, how to be a more be a better person, be a more successful person, a more persuasive person. And obviously it's all science backed, but we would love to hear sort of if there's one prescription people remember to live their lives differently and more effectively after reading your book, what would it be? And so, yeah, Wendy, let's start with you.
Okay. So let me riff off of something that Angela was saying about self-control and what we understand and don't understand about self-control. The classic work in this area, our understanding of self-control, was done by Walter Mischel with 4-year-olds, right? And most of us know about this work. You give a 4-year-old a marshmallow sitting in the room by themselves for 15 minutes. Very few of them can not eat that marshmallow. We all know the paradigm. It's gotten a lot of press. The few people for kids who could resist the marshmallow went on and lived better lives in many ways than the ones who couldn't resist the marshmallow. But there's a condition in that research that is not often discussed that I think is really useful to keep in mind. And that is when the kids were left with this marshmallow, this treat they wanted to eat, but the researchers had put a cake tin on top of it, added a small amount of friction. The kids were told they could pick up the cake tin and eat it anytime they wanted to. But just having that cake tin on top of the marshmallow meant that almost everyone could resist eating it for the 15 minutes. The average was 14 minutes they were able to wait. which is quite astounding to me because very little has been made of that finding, but it illustrates something really important about self-control. And that is self-control depends on the environment that we're in, that the behaviors we repeat, what becomes our habits, is not always a function of our internal drives and motives, but instead it's a function of what's easy or difficult for us in the context that we're in. And simple tweaks like just hiding the marshmallow can change what looks like uncontrolled behavior into self-control. And this is not something that just happens with 4-year-olds, right? There's great research evidence that if you can make behaviors easier, people are more likely to repeat them and they become a habit. If you make behaviors more difficult, even slightly more difficult, hiding under a cake tin, then people are less likely to do them. So understanding the role of the environment in influencing our own habits, the behaviors we repeat, I think is a central message in the book, and the one that I'd like people to take home. And it has all kinds of implications because it suggests that if you're not successful at changing your behavior and meeting your goals, maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's not something wrong with you. Maybe there are strategies, pretty easy strategies that you can use to be more successful in the future. So I think it shifts our understanding a little bit from internal drivers to focusing a bit more on external drivers of behavior.
Wendy, I love that prescription. And I'm seeing Angela's head bobbing because it's something, anyway, we've learned so much from you. And this is, I think, one of the most important lessons, both from your book and sort of so much of your work and so much research that's grown from it. So thank you. Let me turn to Dolly to share a prescription with us next, and then we'll close with Bob and turn to questions.
Sure. I'm going to offer, this is something readers often come back and want to talk about and tell me how it's helped them. I've also written about it in my newsletter. Thank you so much for putting that link in the chat. It's I looked it up in case folks don't have the time to go read a book. These are all free on my website. The July 2020 newsletter last year talked about the 20-60-20 rule. The 20-60-20 rule is something I borrowed from my pre-academic life when I was a consultant. And I worked with a wonderful partner, senior partner in the firm named Susan Annunzio, and we would be sitting down with a CEO at a client and talking about some big change they were making in the company, a new accounting system. And the CEO would say, it's very important that everybody be on board. We have to get buy-in across the company. And Susan would say, we don't actually. In fact, that would be a terrible waste of our time. What we need to do is figure out who's the open 20, who's the 20% who's been waiting for this change. And we need to get out of their way and let them be champions. And who's the 20% who's never coming with us? This is the mountain they're going to die on. This new accounting system is the worst thing that ever happened. And we need to be careful that they do as little damage as possible to others, but we're not going to waste time trying to get them on board. And then most importantly, she would say, this middle 60 is the one that we're going to hear from least. They're on this particular issue, they're just not that invested. They're not thinking that much about the new accounting system. And we're going to forget they're there because they're so quiet. But guess what? They're the one who go where the norms go. They're the ones who follow what others are doing on this particular issue. And so we have tremendous leverage if we can hit the middle 60. And so what I've done in just repurposing her 20-60-20 rule is use it as a way to think about those moments when something happens, someone says a joke or dismisses a candidate or offers a worldview. And this could be a personal occasion or a professional occasion, and you have to make this split-second decision of, should I say something? Do I say something? What do I say? And when do I say it? And how do I say it? I often feel just completely immobilized in those moments, and then play them back in my head a million times, second guessing, often having not done anything and wishing I had done something. Or there's a story I tell in the book of, I like lose my temper or like kind of rage in the moment very ineffectively and then want to redo that. The 20-60-20 rule has been so much more helpful. The 20-60-20 rule says, make a quick judgment. Are they open 20, close 20, or middle 60 on these issues of, let's call it diversity and inclusion issues? If they're open 20, just find the moment to talk to them. They want to know, maybe you pull them aside after, you say, I know this is something you care deeply about, so I knew you'd want me to tell you, this is like telling someone there's lettuce in their teeth. This is what I noticed. I don't know if you know, but I recently learned that word is a really problematic, hurtful word. This is what it means. I didn't know if you knew that. I wanted to tell you. The closed 20, you want to, especially if they've done something publicly, you do want to pop the balloon. Like they've sort of said something and everyone's like, oh, is that funny? Ha. You need to make it clear it's not funny. So you need to say something, but not to convince them. You're speaking to the middle 60. So you say something like, wow, or you say something like, gosh, you don't look old enough to have such old-fashioned views, or ouch. It's just popping the bubble. You're taking their power away. And then the middle 60 is where you really want to spend some time. The middle 60 are the folks that you're going to pull aside and try to talk to privately. Very importantly, I think I know this probably from Bob's research, you want to humanize the issues. When someone isn't deeply invested on an issue, data is not going to be as convincing as stories. You want to talk about, I had this roommate in college and this is something I learned and what I saw her go through. Humanize the issue to bring that middle 60 along. I think I basically just badly summarized Bob's research, but in the form of the 20-60-20 rule, which I have found so helpful.
Dolly, that was an amazing prescription. And it is an amazing segue to Bob, because, your book is such an incredible playbook for thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion. And it leverages so much great behavioral science. And then Bob did a lot of the original research that we use to influence behaviors in so many domains. So I'm really excited that you referenced his incredible insights. And I want to turn to him and ask him for a prescription from influence. Thank you, Dolly.
I'm happy to provide a prescription that comes out of a question that I frequently get from people who've read the book or been in an audience of when I was presenting the principles. They say, so what's the most powerful principle? Which is the one I should use, should have as my favorite, because that's the one that I will be most effective employing. And I always answer it by relating an interaction I had with a colleague, a marketing professor, who said he was going to set out to find the single most impactful approach to influence, right? So how do you do it? What is the single best way to get people to move in your direction? And I saw him at a conference a couple of years later, and he caught me by the elbow. He said, Bob, I found it. I found the single most effective way to be persuasive. Right? It is not to have a single way. That's a fool's game. That's naive to think that the same principle, the same situation will be vulnerable to the same principle, even though you've got a variety of circumstances and relationships with the audience and so on. No. So he said, you can't have a single approach. That's naive. And I think I know why, because if you want to be simultaneously effective and ethical in the process, the way you choose which approach to take, I'll say which principle of influence to take, is to look for the one that's in there, that's naturally inherent in the situation. If there's true scarcity that you can tell people about, use that. If there's true social proof, you've got all this evidence of trends in your direction or market share, whatever, use that one. That's the one to point to. If you've got authority voices speaking in your behalf or aligned with your offer or idea, use that. What that gives us is the ability to inform people into yes. You are educating them by giving them access. You bring that to the surface of something that's truly part of the influence environment there. And that allows you to be ethical in the process. You're never manufacturing or counterfeiting any of these levers of influence. You are simply informing people about them. And I think that's the best way to take. Never have a favorite principle. Use the one that's inherent in the situation that you can point to instead of having to manufacture.
Thank you, Bob. For Bob, for Dolly, and for Wendy, we have a question that was upvoted very popularly from Gabriel Paoletti, and it is this. And it's really about shifting this conversation to contemporary events, politics, the pandemic. And the question is, so I'll actually ask it in order of Wendy, Dolly, Bob. So Wendy first. The question is, what is the most troubling mixed message or common mistake you feel is being made in today's culture for what you study, habit, et cetera?
Okay. I think it's that people don't understand that habits are a relatively separate way of learning. They're a different learning system than our conscious reasoning. So we tend to treat our habits as if they could be controlled, just like we can convince ourselves, we learn, we exert effort, but habits don't function that way. And they function in a much more experiential way. Habits develop through doing. And you don't form a habit just by doing something once or twice or even 3 times. Habit memory forms very slowly, incrementally through experience. So I think it's wishful thinking. We'd all love it if we could change our habits just by waking up some morning and saying, I've made a decision, I'm going to be different. But that's not the way they work. So trying to figure out how habits actually do work is something that researchers have been pretty successful at in the last few years. And I think that's what people don't understand.
Great. So habits are created through doing many times as opposed to thinking and having one epiphany. And I think, Wendy, you've also gone to great pains to inform the world that there's no magic number of days. Yes. That it's like when the odometer turns. Okay.
That's the other wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be great if we could say, okay, I do this 15 times and I finally formed a habit. But habits are a learning system. And so things that are more difficult to learn just take longer than things that are simpler. And there is no magic number. In fact, the idea that there's 21 days, right, till you form a habit, that apparently came from a book written by someone describing how long it takes for us to get used to changes from plastic surgery. So it didn't even have anything to do with behavior. Anyhow.
I was not reading that book, by the way, and I'm sure you weren't either. But that's good words to the wise, and the wise are in this conversation. Dolly, thinking about contemporary events, what is one mixed message or misconception that you would like to speak to?
Sure. I think there is a a view of issues about bias, diversity, inclusion, equity being purely issues of morality. And the misconception there is, while there's certainly elements of morality there, skills and knowledge are really important as well. And that's where the growth mindset, being goodish, becomes so important. So you can have your heart in the right place, but if you don't have the skills to challenge systems, if you don't have the knowledge of groups different than yours, if you don't have an awareness of the ways in which your unconscious, your automatic processes are leading you to have unintended harmful impact on others, I call that psychological literacy, that morality alone will not get you there. So the importance of skills and knowledge.
Psychological literacy is a phrase for the 21st century, if there ever were one. Okay,
Yeah.
so Bob, do you have any psychologically literate things to say about contemporary misconception or mixed message?
I'm not going to claim that this is literate, but I'll give you an example from the principle of, I think where I see the greatest mismatch is within the principle of authority and the confusion between being in authority and being an authority. Right? People don't really make that distinction properly. That being in authority is to be in charge, to have the ability to exert some sort of sanctions, to create a behavior that's a desired behavior. That's about power. It's not about persuasion. Being an authority, however, and informing people of some information they didn't have before that changes their beliefs, changes their attitudes. Those beliefs and attitudes then are retained. If the authority who is in authority has left the scene, well, that person's influence isn't very active at that point. But if you are an authority and you've been able to truly convince someone to another point of view, that's durable, that lasts. And so that's the one that I would try to clarify, just because, and we see this these days with somebody's in a position of power, a legislator or a governor or a politician, a president, right? That doesn't make this person an authority. It just makes them in authority. And that's a big difference in terms of who we should follow.
I think we should all be following all of you, Dolly, Wendy, and Bob. I want to say thank you for being truly the world-class authorities on your subject. And I'll pass the mic to Katie to close us out for this lunch hour.
This was honestly so much fun. I wish we could go for another hour. And I'm excited that hundreds and hundreds of people tuned in live, and thousands more can watch when we post this to YouTube later this year. I just wanted to thank everyone. You were all amazing, and also make a little plug for the fact that although this is our last event of 2021, it is not going to be our last author event by any stretch. We have a wonderful lineup starting in the spring of 2022. Well, actually the winter of 2022. We're going to have a fresh new name. We'll be calling this Behavioral Science Authors Brought to You by BCFG, because maybe not everyone knew what BCFG or authors at BCFG meant. And we're really excited about the authors we're going to be featuring next year. We'll include Ayelet Fishbach of the University of Chicago and John List of the University of Chicago, Nina Mazar of Boston University, Dilip Soman of the University of Toronto, Don Moore of UC Berkeley, and Max Bazerman of Harvard. And Ayelet Fishbach will kick us off with a discussion of her new book, Get It Done, on Friday, January 21st at noon Eastern time. And you can register at the link that's in chat, and we will soon be sending an initial announcement. So thank you for joining. We're going to end on time.